A lonely widow helped a homeless man, unaware he was the answer to her prayers that had seemed to echo unanswered into an empty sky for far too long. Margaret Wilson stood at her kitchen window, staring out at the rain-slicked streets of Oak Ridge, the same view she'd gazed upon for 43 years, though the last 3 had been without Robert by her side. The November wind rattled the glass panes, an intrusion that matched the hollow feeling in her chest. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around her thin frame. The house had grown colder since Robert passed. No matter how high she set the thermostat, the chill remained, settling into her bones like an unwelcome houseguest who refused to leave. The kettle whistled, its shrill cry piercing the silence that had become her constant companion. Margaret moved slowly toward the stove, her slippers whispering against the linoleum floor. Tea had become a ritual, something to mark the passage of time in days that blended one into another. 1 cup, 1 spoon, 1 tea bag. She couldn't bring herself to donate Robert's favorite mug, blue with white sailing ships, even though it sat collecting dust in the cupboard. Sometimes, in moments of profound loneliness, she would take it out and run her fingers along the rim, remembering how his lips had touched it every morning for decades. Margaret carried her tea to the living room, easing herself into the armchair by the window. From here, she could watch the neighborhood come alive. Mothers hurrying children to school, young professionals rushing to catch the 7:45 bus, elderly couples taking their synchronized morning walks. Life continuing all around her while hers felt suspended in amber. The mantel clock ticked loudly, counting seconds that stretched into minutes, hours, days. Beside it stood framed photographs, her wedding day, Robert's proud smile as he held their infant daughter, Ellie's college graduation. A visual timeline of a life well lived, now relegated to memory. Ellie called every Sunday from Seattle, her voice bright and busy, full of stories about her children and her thriving architectural firm. Margaret cherished these calls but felt the weight of the 2,000 miles between them like physical pressure on her chest. Visits were rare, twice a year if she was lucky, and always too brief, a whirlwind of activity that left her house feeling emptier than before when they departed. "You should join a club, Mom," Ellie had suggested during their last call. "Or volunteer somewhere. You can't just sit in that house alone all the time." Margaret had murmured agreement, knowing she wouldn't follow through. The thought of forcing conversation with strangers exhausted her. What would she even talk about? Her life had become a series of small routines: grocery shopping on Tuesdays, hair appointment every 3rd Thursday, changing the sheets on Mondays even though they were rarely slept in on both sides anymore. The steady drumming of rain against the roof intensified. Margaret sipped her tea and watched droplets race down the window pane, merging and separating in unpredictable patterns. Outside, the wind had picked up, sending fallen leaves skittering across her front yard in russet tornado spirals. It was on days like this that she missed Robert most acutely. He would have been in the garage, tinkering with his old radio set or refinishing some yard sale furniture find, his hands always busy creating or fixing. 40 years together hadn't been enough. There were still so many things left unsaid, so many moments they'd planned for retirement that would never come. Margaret set down her empty teacup and pushed herself up from the chair. Thursdays meant the senior grocery discount at Harmon's Market. She had a list, short but precise, clipped to the refrigerator with a magnet from their trip to Niagara Falls 15 years ago. The gray sky had darkened further when Margaret emerged from her house, umbrella unfurled against the persistent rain. She locked the door behind her, a habit Robert had instilled in her even though Oak Ridge had always been a safe community, and made her way carefully down the slick steps. The walk to Harmon's was 6 blocks, a journey Margaret had made countless times. Today, however, the wind fought against her umbrella, turning it inside out twice before she surrendered and let herself get wet. By the time she reached the store, her gray hair was plastered to her scalp, and her beige raincoat had darkened with moisture. "Goodness, Margaret, you're soaked through!" Betty Harmon exclaimed as she entered. The grocer's wife had known Margaret for 30 years, their children having gone to school together. "John," she called to her husband, "put the kettle on for Margaret, will you?" Margaret shook her head, embarrassed by the attention. "I'm fine, really. Just need to pick up a few things." "Nonsense. You'll catch your death." Betty ushered her toward the small office at the back of the store where a space heater hummed. "Sit. Warm up. Then you can do your shopping." Too tired to argue, Margaret sank into the offered chair, her wet clothes uncomfortable against her skin. The heat from the space heater gradually penetrated her damp layers, bringing painful tingling to her numb fingers. Betty returned with a steaming mug. "Drink this." John's watching the front. Margaret accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "Thank you. You know," Betty said, settling into the chair opposite, "we deliver now, for our senior customers. You don't have to come out in weather like this." Margaret bristled slightly at being categorized as someone who needed special accommodation. "I like the walk, usually." Betty's eyes were kind but concerned. "You're too thin, Margaret. Are you eating properly?" The question hung in the air, loaded with unstated worry. Margaret had heard variations of it from Ellie, from her doctor, from the few friends who still checked in on her. "I manage," she replied simply, sipping the tea to avoid further conversation. After warming up, Margaret thanked Betty and made her way through the store, consulting her list. Bread, eggs, coffee, soup, apples, chicken breast, just enough for one person for a few days. The economy-sized packages she'd once bought when the house was full now seemed wasteful, excessive. At the checkout, John Harmon rang up her items while making small talk about the weather, the upcoming town festival, his grandson's soccer championship. Margaret nodded and smiled at appropriate intervals, a social performance she'd perfected. "Need help out to your car?" John asked as he handed her the single bag. "I walked," Margaret said, already dreading the return journey through the intensifying storm. John frowned. "Wait here." He disappeared into the back and returned with a large black umbrella. "Take this. It's sturdier than those collapsible things." "I couldn't possibly—" "You can return it next time," he insisted, placing it in her hand. "And Margaret? Consider the delivery service." Betty meant well. Margaret nodded, touched by their concern even as she bristled at the implication that she couldn't manage on her own. She had been independent before Robert, had worked as a librarian until Ellie was born, had run the household finances, had organized their social calendar. His death hadn't rendered her helpless, just hollow. Outside, the rain had somehow intensified, sheeting down in silver curtains that blurred the outlines of buildings across the street. Margaret opened John's umbrella, relieved when it held firm against the gusting wind. She stepped carefully from the shelter of the store's awning, clutching her grocery bag close. The walk home seemed longer, each step requiring concentration on the slick sidewalk. Halfway there, the wind suddenly reversed direction, catching the umbrella and yanking it backward with such force that Margaret nearly lost her balance. The grocery bag slipped from her grasp, spilling its contents across the wet pavement. "No, no, no," she murmured, watching helplessly as her bread soaked up rainwater and an apple rolled toward the street. Fatigue and frustration welled up inside her, condensing into a hard knot in her throat. As she bent to salvage what she could, a weathered hand appeared in her field of vision, retrieving the escaped apple from a growing puddle. "Let me help you, ma'am." Margaret looked up to see a man kneeling beside her. His beard was untrimmed, his clothes visibly worn, but his eyes, a remarkable shade of blue that reminded her of summer skies, were kind and clear. He appeared to be in his 50s, though the hardness of his life had likely added years to his appearance. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the instinctive response of a woman who had been taught never to accept help from strangers, especially men. He didn't argue, just continued gathering her scattered groceries and placing them carefully back in the bag, which he'd rescued from a puddle. "The eggs seem okay," he said, checking the carton, "but the bread's seen better days." His voice had an unexpected gentleness to it, a soft baritone with a hint of a southern accent. Despite her initial wariness, Margaret found herself accepting his assistance. "Thank you," she said stiffly as he handed her the salvaged bag. "You live far from here?" he asked, making no move to leave despite the rain soaking through his jacket. "Just 3 blocks," Margaret replied, then immediately regretted providing even that much information. The man nodded, looking up at the sky as if consulting with the clouds themselves. "Storm's getting worse. Mind if I walk with you? This umbrella looks big enough for 2 and I could use the shelter." Margaret hesitated. Common sense warned against trusting strangers, but something in the man's demeanor, a dignity despite his circumstances, made her reconsider. Plus, she reasoned, they were on a public street in broad daylight. "I suppose that would be all right," she said finally. The man smiled, revealing a missing tooth on the left side. "Much obliged." He positioned himself beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance while still staying under the umbrella's protection. "Name's Daniel, by the way. Daniel Forrester." "Margaret Wilson," she replied, then wondered why she'd offered her full name. They walked in silence for a block, the only sounds the drumming of rain on the umbrella and the splash of their footsteps through puddles. Despite her initial reservations, Margaret found Daniel's presence oddly comforting, a buffer against the hostility of the weather. "You got someone waiting at home for you?" Daniel asked as they waited for a car to pass before crossing the street. The innocent question pierced Margaret unexpectedly. "Not anymore," she said simply. Daniel nodded, seeming to understand all that remained unsaid. "That's hard." "Being alone?" "Yes." The single syllable contained multitudes. They continued walking, Daniel subtly adjusting his pace to match her slower steps. At her driveway, Margaret paused, unsure of the proper protocol. Inviting him in was out of the question, but simply dismissing him to continue in the downpour seemed cruel. "My porch has an overhang," she found herself saying. "You could wait there until the rain lets up a bit." Surprise flickered across Daniel's weather-lined face. "That's mighty kind of you." They made their way up the path to her front door, where Margaret fumbled with her keys, suddenly self-conscious. The porch light illuminated Daniel more clearly now, the patches on his coat, the frayed edges of his jeans, the worn soles of his boots. Yet there was nothing threatening about him. If anything, he seemed more concerned with not imposing than with taking advantage. "Would you like some tea?" The words escaped before Margaret could reconsider. "To warm up." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. "If it's not too much trouble." Margaret unlocked the door, hesitating one final moment before stepping inside and holding it open for him. "You can leave your boots by the door?" she said, removing her own wet shoes. Daniel carefully untied his boots, revealing mismatched socks with holes at the toes. He placed the boots neatly on the mat, then stood awkwardly in the entryway, clearly conscious of his dampness. "The kitchen's this way," Margaret said, leading him through the living room. She was suddenly aware of her home through a stranger's eyes, the dated wallpaper, the well-worn furniture, the abundance of knickknacks accumulated over decades. In the kitchen, Margaret busied herself with the kettle, grateful for the familiar routine. "I hope you like chamomile. It's all I have besides black tea." "Chamomile's fine," Daniel said, remaining standing until Margaret gestured toward a chair at the small kitchen table. As the water heated, an awkward silence descended. Margaret arranged cookies, store-bought and slightly stale, on a plate, more for something to do than from any real hospitality. "You have a lovely home," Daniel offered, his eyes taking in the sunny yellow walls Robert had painted 20 years ago, the collection of decorative spoons from various states hanging in a display case, the refrigerator covered with children's drawings, her grandchildren's artwork that Ellie sent regularly. "We bought it when we were first married," Margaret said, surprised at herself for volunteering information. "Raised our daughter here." "Just the one?" "Yes." Margaret poured hot water into 2 mugs, dropping tea bags into each. "We wanted more, but it wasn't meant to be." Daniel accepted the mug she offered with both hands, as if savoring the warmth. "Children are a blessing. Do you have any?" Margaret asked, then immediately regretted the question. A homeless man was unlikely to have maintained family connections, but Daniel nodded, his expression softening. "A son. He's in California now." "Computer programmer?" Pride threaded through his voice alongside something more complex. Regret, perhaps. Margaret sat across from him, curiosity warring with her ingrained politeness that discouraged prying. "You don't see him?" Daniel stared into his tea. "It's complicated. I wasn't always like this." He gestured vaguely at himself. "Made some bad choices. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild." The rain continued its assault outside, creating a cocoon of sound around the kitchen. Margaret found herself studying Daniel more carefully. Beneath the weathered exterior, she could see traces of the man he must have been once, in the straight set of his shoulders, the articulate speech, the careful way he held his mug with his pinky slightly extended, a gesture of ingrained manners. "How long have you been—" She trailed off, unsure of the appropriate terminology. "Homeless?" Daniel supplied without rancor. "Going on 3 years now. Lost my job when the factory closed. Then my wife left, took the house in the divorce. Started drinking too much." He shrugged. The usual sad story. There was no self-pity in his tone, just a matter-of-fact accounting. Margaret felt a surprising connection to this stranger, both of them victims of life's unexpected turns, though in vastly different ways. "My husband died 3 years ago," she found herself saying. "Heart attack. He was only 68. Daniel nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Margaret sipped her tea, the familiar taste grounding her. Sometimes I think the hardest part is the silence. After decades of another person's breathing, footsteps, voice, the absence of sound is deafening. I understand, Daniel said quietly. Though for me, it's too much noise. Shelters, streets, there's never real quiet. Never real privacy. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the rain providing a rhythmic backdrop to their unexpected communion. The cookies are good, Daniel said, taking a second one. Margaret smiled slightly. They're store-bought. I used to bake, but it seems pointless now, just for myself. Some things are worth doing just for yourself, Daniel observed, brushing crumbs from his beard. Reminds you you're still here, still worthy of care. The simple wisdom in his words struck Margaret deeply. When had she stopped considering herself worthy of care? When had existing replaced living? The rain finally began to slacken, the drumming on the roof easing to a gentler patter. Daniel noticed too, glancing toward the window. I should get going, he said, rising and carrying his mug to the sink. Thank you for the tea and shelter. Both were most appreciated. Margaret stood as well, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. The brief conversation had been the most meaningful human interaction she'd had in months, excluding Ellie's calls. Where will you go? She asked. Daniel offered a small smile. There's a bridge over on Maple Street. Stays pretty dry underneath. Seeing her expression, he added, Don't worry about me. I've weathered worse storms than this one. Margaret walked him to the door, where he carefully pulled on his still damp boots. An idea formed in her mind, impulsive and perhaps foolish, but insistent. I have a shed, she said abruptly. In the backyard. Robert used it as a workshop. It has electricity, even a small space heater. It's not much, but it would be dry. Daniel turned to her, surprise evident on his face. Are you offering me a place to stay? Margaret nodded, surprising herself with her certainty. Just until the weather improves. The forecast said the storm might last through tomorrow. Why would you do that for a stranger? Daniel asked, his blue eyes searching her face. Margaret considered the question. Why indeed? Because you helped me when I needed it, she said finally. And because I think Robert would have done the same. Daniel held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded solemnly. I'd be grateful, and I promise you won't regret your kindness. Margaret showed him to the backyard shed, unlocking the padlock that had remained in place since Robert's death. The smell of sawdust and motor oil rushed out, Robert's smell, bringing an unexpected tightness to her throat. The interior was cluttered but clean. Robert's workbench dominated one wall, tools hanging in precise arrangements above it. A small couch he'd kept for rest breaks sat against the opposite wall. Margaret switched on the space heater, watching as Daniel took in his surroundings with evident appreciation. This is more than generous, he said, running a hand along the workbench. Your husband was a craftsman? An accountant, actually, Margaret replied. But he loved working with his hands. Made most of our furniture? Daniel nodded appreciatively. A man of many talents. There are some old blankets in that trunk. Margaret indicated a wooden chest in the corner. And I'll bring you some dinner later if that's all right. More than all right, Daniel said, his voice thick with gratitude. Thank you, Margaret. As she walked back to the house, Margaret felt lighter than she had in months. The simple act of helping another person had awakened something long dormant within her, a sense of purpose, of connection to the world beyond her grief. Inside, she opened her refrigerator, assessing its meager contents with new eyes. The soup and chicken she'd purchased would make a decent meal for two. Perhaps there was enough flour to bake bread to replace the ruined loaf. Perhaps she could remember how to cook for someone other than herself. As she began to prepare the meal, Margaret realized she was humming, a small, unconscious expression of contentment that had been absent from her kitchen for 3 long years. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside, a tiny flame of human connection had been kindled, pushing back against the darkness 1 degree at a time. The transformation began with soup. Margaret hadn't made homemade chicken soup since Robert's funeral, when neighbors and church friends had emptied her freezer of carefully labeled containers faster than she could keep track. Back then, cooking had been therapeutic, a way to channel grief into something productive, something nurturing. But as the months passed and the house remained empty save for her solitary presence, the effort had seemed increasingly pointless. Now, as she chopped carrots and celery with methodical precision, Margaret felt a forgotten rhythm returning to her movements. The knife against the cutting board, the gentle simmer of the broth, the earthy aroma of fresh herbs. These sensations anchored her to the present moment in a way she hadn't experienced in years. By 5 o'clock, the kitchen was filled with steam and savory scents. Margaret had not only made soup, but had also mixed and kneaded a simple loaf of bread that now sat rising near the oven's warmth. The physical exertion had brought color to her cheeks and a slight ache to her underused muscles, discomforts she welcomed as signs of life returning. While the bread baked, she found herself opening cabinets and drawers that had remained closed for too long. From the dining room hutch came the good bowls, ceramic, hand-painted with delicate blue flowers, a wedding gift they'd saved for special occasions. She wiped away dust and arranged them on a tray alongside linen napkins, proper spoons, and a small jar of wildflower honey Robert had bought at their last farmer's market visit together, untouched since his passing. The extravagance made her pause. Was she overstepping, creating expectations she couldn't fulfill? Daniel was a stranger, after all, a homeless man she'd invited to sleep in her shed during a storm, nothing more. Yet something in his dignified bearing, in the careful way he'd gathered her spilled groceries without judgment, suggested a man who would appreciate such gestures without presuming upon them. When the bread emerged from the oven, golden and fragrant, Margaret felt a surge of accomplishment she hadn't experienced in months. She wrapped the loaf in a clean kitchen towel to keep it warm, poured the soup into a thermos, and arranged everything on the tray. Outside, dusk had fallen, the rain reduced to a gentle patter against leaves and pavement. The air was cool and fresh as Margaret made her way across the backyard, balancing the tray carefully. Light spilled from the shed's single window, a warm beacon in the gathering darkness. She knocked gently on the door, suddenly self-conscious. "Daniel? I've brought some dinner." The door opened immediately, as if he'd been waiting. Daniel's face registered surprise at the elaborate spread in her hands. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It wasn't trouble," Margaret said, surprised to find she meant it. "May I come in?" Daniel stepped back, gesturing her inside with an almost courtly movement. "Please." The shed had been transformed in her absence. The clutter had been organized, tools rehung precisely, surfaces dusted. The small couch now wore the blankets she'd mentioned, neatly arranged as a makeshift bed. A book from Robert's collection sat open on the workbench, one of his woodworking guides. "I hope you don't mind," Daniel said, following her gaze. "I got restless and thought I might make myself useful." "Not at all," Margaret replied, touched by his consideration. She set the tray on the cleared workbench. "I brought soup and fresh bread. Nothing fancy." Daniel's expression suggested it was the most extravagant meal he'd been offered in some time. "It smells wonderful." Margaret hesitated, suddenly uncertain of protocol. Should she leave him to eat in privacy or... As if sensing her dilemma, Daniel pulled forward a workshop stool. "Would you join me? Unless you have other plans, of course." The invitation, offered with no expectation, decided her. "I'd like that." They settled into an unexpectedly comfortable meal, steam rising from the fragrant soup, bread torn rather than sliced, a casual intimacy that reminded Margaret of picnics and camping trips long ago. Daniel ate with the measured pace of someone savoring each bite, occasionally closing his eyes to fully appreciate a particular flavor. "This is exceptional," he said after his first spoonful. "You're a talented cook." "My mother's recipe," Margaret admitted. She believed chicken soup could cure anything from colds to broken hearts. A wise woman. Daniel tore off another piece of bread. And was she right? About the broken hearts? Margaret considered the question. It helps. For a while, at least. Food is connection. Sharing a meal acknowledges our common humanity. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. That's why it's so hard sometimes. In shelters or soup kitchens, the food sustains the body, but often there's no communion in it. No sharing of souls across a table. The observation struck Margaret with its insight. She'd never considered how much dignity resided in the simple act of breaking bread as equals. "Have you always been this philosophical?" she asked, curious about the man behind the circumstances. A small smile crossed Daniel's face. "I was a high school literature teacher once upon a time, before the factory job." Margaret stared at him, recalibrating her assumptions. "A teacher?" Daniel shrugged slightly. "For almost 20 years. Small town in Virginia. Lost my position when the school district consolidated. Couldn't find another teaching job. Too specialized, too expensive with my experience level." Ended up in manufacturing because it paid the bills. He tore off another piece of bread. Life takes unexpected turns. Indeed it does, Margaret murmured, thinking of her own carefully planned retirement with Robert, the trips they'd never take, the grandchildren he'd never see grow up. As they continued eating, Daniel shared more fragments of his previous life, the students he'd inspired, the classics he'd taught, the Shakespeare Club he'd sponsored. His face animated with the telling, years seeming to fall away as he recounted small triumphs and memorable moments. "Sorry," he said eventually, looking embarrassed. "I'm talking too much. It's been a while since anyone asked." "I don't mind," Margaret said truthfully. "It's nice to hear stories again." They finished the meal as the rain strengthened once more, drumming against the shed's roof in a soothing rhythm. Margaret found herself reluctant to leave this unexpected pocket of companionship and return to her silent house. "I should let you rest," she said finally, gathering the dishes. "The weather report says the storm should clear by tomorrow afternoon." Daniel helped her arrange everything back on the tray. "Thank you again, Margaret. Not just for the meal, but for treating me like a person worth knowing." The simple gratitude in his voice brought a lump to Margaret's throat. "You are worth knowing," she said quietly. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night." Walking back to the house through the gentle rain, Margaret realized she felt more present in her body, more connected to the moment than she had in years. The cool droplets on her face, the weight of the tray in her hands, the glow of her kitchen window ahead, all registered with newfound clarity. Inside, she washed the dishes methodically, her mind still lingering on their conversation. A literature teacher. It explained his articulate speech, his thoughtful observations. What a waste of knowledge and experience, lost to circumstance and bad luck. Before going to bed, Margaret found herself at the living room bookshelf, fingers tracing the spines of Robert's beloved classics. She selected a few volumes, Steinbeck, Hemingway, a collection of poetry, and set them aside for Daniel. Perhaps he would enjoy revisiting old friends. That night, for the first time in recent memory, Margaret fell asleep quickly, without the usual hours of restless tossing and turning. The sound of rain on the roof, rather than emphasizing her solitude, now connected her to the knowledge that someone else was listening to the same rhythm, just yards away in Robert's shed. Morning arrived with unexpected brightness. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through her curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a washed, clean world sparkling with droplets. She rose with unusual energy, drawn to the kitchen by a new sense of purpose. Without conscious decision, she found herself mixing pancake batter, another forgotten morning ritual from when the house held more than one occupant. As she was about to head to the shed with a plate of steaming pancakes, a knock sounded at her back door. Daniel stood there, freshly washed from the looks of his damp hair, holding a small bouquet of still glistening late roses from her garden. "Good morning," he said, offering the flowers. "I hope you don't mind. They looked so beautiful after the rain, and I thought they might brighten your table." Margaret accepted the simple gift, touched by the gesture. "They're lovely." "Thank you." She held up the plate. "I was just bringing you breakfast." Daniel smiled. "Great minds think alike. I was coming to see if I could help with anything before I get out of your hair." The reminder of their temporary arrangement brought an unexpected pang. "You're welcome to stay for breakfast first," Margaret said. "These are better hot." They ate at her kitchen table, morning light streaming through the window and illuminating the roses now arranged in a small vase between them. Daniel complimented her cooking with genuine appreciation, and they fell into easy conversation about the garden, the neighborhood, inconsequential things that nonetheless felt significant in their ordinariness. "I noticed your gutters are clogged on the east side," Daniel mentioned as he helped clear the dishes. "Probably why there was so much water pooling by your foundation yesterday." "I could clean them out for you before I go." Margaret started to protest that she couldn't accept more help, then stopped herself. Why not? Pride had kept her struggling alone with home maintenance tasks that once were Robert's domain. Perhaps accepting help was its own kind of strength. "If you wouldn't mind," she said instead. "That would be very kind." Daniel set to work with tools from the shed, moving the ladder methodically around the house, clearing leaves and debris from gutters that hadn't been maintained since Robert's death. Margaret watched from below, handing up tools when requested, struck by the simple companionship of the task. The work took most of the morning. By noon, with the gutters cleared and downspouts running freely, they sat on the back porch steps, sharing sandwiches Margaret had prepared. "Everything looks better after a storm," Daniel observed, gesturing toward the garden where raindrops still clung to petals and leaves. Margaret nodded, following his gaze. "Cleansed. I should be moving on soon," Daniel said after a comfortable silence. "You've been more than generous." The words, though expected, landed heavily. Margaret realized she wasn't ready for this brief connection to end, this window into a world beyond her grief. "Where will you go?" she asked. Daniel shrugged slightly. "There's a day labor spot downtown. Might pick up some construction work if I'm lucky. Then back under the bridge, I suppose." Margaret hesitated, an idea forming, impulsive, perhaps unwise, but insistent nonetheless. "My daughter called last week," she said, the words coming slowly as she worked through her thoughts. "She's worried about me being alone in this big house, especially with winter coming." The gutters were just the beginning. There's weather stripping to replace, storm windows to install. The furnace needs servicing. Daniel listened attentively, his expression open but unassuming. "I was thinking," Margaret continued, her heart beating quickly now, "perhaps we could make an arrangement. The shed has that small sofa bed, and with the space heater it's quite comfortable. You could stay there, help with some of these tasks I can't manage alone, and in exchange have a safe place to sleep, regular meals." She rushed on before doubt could overtake her. "Just until you find something more permanent, of course. It would help us both, I think." Daniel studied her face, his blue eyes serious. "Are you certain? You hardly know me." "I'm a good judge of character," Margaret said, surprising herself with her confidence. "Robert always said so." She paused. "But I'd understand if you'd rather not." Daniel looked out at the garden again, seeming to weigh multiple considerations. Finally, he turned back to her with a nod. "I accept your offer with gratitude, and I promise you won't regret your kindness." Relief flooded through Margaret, relief and something else, something like hope. "Well then," she said, extending her hand in a formal gesture that felt appropriate for this new arrangement. "Welcome." Daniel's hand, rough with calluses but warm, clasped hers firmly. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, Margaret. Not many would." That afternoon, they worked together in comfortable tandem. Daniel inventoried the shed, making lists of needed supplies for house repairs, while Margaret tackled long-neglected phone calls to service companies, scheduling the furnace maintenance and chimney cleaning she'd been postponing. By evening, they had developed a tentative plan for the coming weeks. Daniel would handle the physical tasks of winterizing the house, while Margaret would cook and provide materials. It was a simple arrangement, but to Margaret it felt monumental. The first time since Robert's death that she had engaged with the future beyond mere existence. As darkness fell, they shared another meal at her kitchen table, this time a casserole Margaret had found in her recipe box, untouched for years. The easy conversation, the sharing of bread and salt, the simple human connection, all felt like water to a parched plant. Later, as she prepared for bed, Margaret caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror and paused, startled by her own reflection. There was color in her cheeks, animation in her expression. She looked alive in a way she hadn't for 3 years. "What am I doing?" she whispered to her reflection, a moment of doubt surfacing. Taking in a homeless stranger, making plans, opening herself to potential disappointment, or worse. But as she turned away from the mirror, her eyes fell on Robert's bathrobe still hanging on the back of the door, preserved like a museum piece. What would he think of her actions? She could almost hear his practical voice. "Maggie, you've been alone too long. Everyone needs purpose. Everyone needs connection." With that imagined blessing, Margaret slept peacefully for the second night in a row, the knowledge of another human presence on her property providing an unexpected comfort. The next morning established what would become their routine. Margaret woke early to prepare breakfast, which they shared at the kitchen table, discussing the day ahead. Daniel then set off for whatever project was most pressing, while Margaret tended to household tasks or errands. Their first week passed in a flurry of productivity. Daniel replaced weather stripping around doors and windows, cleaned and installed storm windows, and repaired a section of fence that had been leaning precariously since the previous winter. His work was meticulous, his knowledge of home repair surprisingly extensive. "My father was a handyman," he explained when Margaret commented on his skills. "I grew up holding the flashlight while he fixed things. You absorb more than you realize." Margaret found herself sharing stories of her own, of Robert's painstaking restoration of their Victorian home, of Ellie's childhood adventures in the backyard, of her years as a librarian before becoming a mother. Topics she hadn't spoken of in years flowed naturally into their conversations, painful at first, but gradually becoming sources of warmth rather than grief. On Sunday, Margaret faced her weekly call with Ellie with newfound energy. "You sound different, Mom," Ellie observed almost immediately. "More present." Margaret hesitated, unsure how to explain Daniel's presence to her protective daughter. "I've been busy with some house projects," she said carefully, "getting ready for winter." "That's great," Ellie replied, clearly surprised but pleased. "Did you hire someone to help?" "Something like that," Margaret said, opting for partial truth. "A local handyman is helping with the bigger tasks." The conversation moved on to Ellie's children and work, but Margaret felt a twinge of guilt at the omission. She would need to tell Ellie about Daniel eventually, but not yet, not until she was sure of the arrangement herself. As autumn deepened, their routine expanded and evolved. Daniel began spending evenings in the main house, initially just for dinner but gradually staying longer to read or watch television with Margaret. His knowledge of literature brought new life to Robert's neglected library, as he and Margaret discussed favorite novels and poems. "You should read this to your students," he said one evening, passing her a volume of Mary Oliver's poetry. Her observations of nature would resonate with young minds. Margaret accepted the book, touched by his assumption that she still had something valuable to contribute. "I haven't taught in 15 years, she reminded him. "Not since Ellie started school." Daniel shrugged. "Knowledge doesn't expire. Neither does the ability to inspire." His simple faith in her capabilities planted a seed, one that would take time to germinate but had found fertile soil. October gave way to November, and with it came the first real cold snap. Margaret worried about Daniel in the shed, despite the space heater and extra blankets she'd provided. "It's fine," he assured her, zipping up the warm coat she'd found in Robert's closet, one of several items she'd hesitantly offered and he'd gratefully accepted. "I've slept in far worse conditions." Still, on particularly cold nights, Margaret found herself lying awake, listening to the wind and worrying about his comfort. Those concerns led to practical solutions: an electric mattress pad for the sofa bed, better insulation around the shed windows, a small coffee maker so he wouldn't have to come to the main house first thing on frigid mornings. Each improvement made the shed less temporary, more a proper living space. Neither of them commented on this evolution, but both recognized it for what it was: an unspoken extension of their arrangement beyond the initial winter preparations. As Thanksgiving approached, Margaret faced a dilemma. Ellie and her family were coming for the holiday, their first visit since Daniel had entered Margaret's life. The time had come to explain his presence. She chose a Sunday evening, after a particularly pleasant day spent planting bulbs together for spring flowering. They sat in the living room, Daniel reading while Margaret knitted, another abandoned hobby she'd recently resumed. "I need to talk to you about something," she began, setting aside her yarn. Daniel closed his book, giving her his full attention, a simple courtesy that she'd come to appreciate deeply. "My daughter and her family are coming for Thanksgiving," she continued. "They'll be here for 4 days." "I understand," Daniel said immediately. "I can make myself scarce. Perhaps there's a shelter in the next town where I could—" "No," Margaret interrupted, surprised by her own vehemence. "That's not what I meant at all. I want you to join us for Thanksgiving." "As my guest?" Daniel's expression registered surprise, then uncertainty. "Are you sure that would be appropriate? What will your daughter think?" It was a fair question, one Margaret had been asking herself repeatedly. "I've been thinking about that. I haven't been entirely forthcoming with Ellie about our arrangement. It's time I was honest." Daniel nodded slowly. "And what exactly will you tell her?" Margaret took a deep breath. "The truth. That I met a man who needed temporary shelter, who in turn has helped me more than he knows. That we've become friends." The word felt simultaneously inadequate and profound. "Friends," Daniel repeated, a small smile warming his features. "I like that. So you'll stay? Meet my family?" Daniel hesitated, vulnerability crossing his weathered face. "Are you sure?" "I wouldn't want to cause any tension during your family time." Margaret reached across the space between them and took his hand, the first deliberate physical contact she'd initiated. "I'm sure. You've become important to me, Daniel. An unexpected blessing. I want them to know you. His fingers tightened around hers briefly before releasing. "Then I accept. Thank you." The conversation with Ellie proved more challenging. Margaret chose to make it over the phone the following evening, rather than springing Daniel's presence on her daughter without warning. "You did what?" Ellie's voice rose in concern after Margaret explained the situation. "Mom, do you have any idea how dangerous that could have been? Taking in a homeless stranger?" "He's not a stranger anymore," Margaret replied calmly. "And Daniel is a good man who's fallen on hard times. Educated, respectful, hardworking." "That doesn't mean—" Ellie began. "I know you're worried," Margaret interrupted gently. "That's natural, but I need you to trust my judgment. Daniel has been nothing but helpful and kind. He's brought something back to this house that's been missing for a long time." "And what's that?" Ellie asked, still sounding skeptical. Margaret considered the question carefully. "Life," she said finally. "He's brought life back." A long silence followed. "You really care about him," Ellie said, her tone now curious rather than accusatory. "I do," Margaret admitted. "Not in the way you might be thinking, but as a friend." "An important one." Another pause. "Okay," Ellie said finally. "I'll reserve judgment until I meet him. But Mom, please be careful with your heart. I couldn't bear to see you hurt again." The concern in her daughter's voice touched Margaret deeply. "I know, sweetheart. I'm being careful. But sometimes caring is worth the risk." After hanging up, Margaret sat quietly, reflecting on her own words. Was she being careful? The truth was more complicated. Daniel had already changed her life in ways she couldn't have anticipated, awakening interests, energy, and emotions she'd thought permanently dormant. If he were to leave tomorrow, the pain would be significant. Yet that very vulnerability felt like evidence of healing. To risk pain was to be fully alive again. The days before Thanksgiving passed quickly, filled with preparations. Margaret found herself baking and cleaning with an energy she hadn't felt in years. Daniel helped where he could, moving furniture for deep cleaning, reaching high shelves, carrying boxes of holiday decorations from the attic. Together they transformed the house from a museum of memories to a warm, welcoming home. Margaret polished silver that had tarnished from disuse, washed china that had gathered dust, and aired table linens that had been stored away since the last holiday before Robert's death. "You're enjoying this," Daniel observed as he helped her set the dining room table the night before Ellie's arrival. Margaret smoothed a hand over the damask tablecloth. "I am. I'd forgotten how much I love preparing for people I care about." "It shows," Daniel said, carefully placing a crystal water glass at each setting. "The house feels happy." The observation struck Margaret with its simple accuracy. The house did feel happy, as if the walls themselves were exhaling after holding their breath for 3 long years. Ellie and her family arrived the following afternoon, her husband Mark carrying suitcases, 13-year-old Jacob immediately looking for Wi-Fi access, and 10-year-old Emma rushing to hug her grandmother with unrestrained affection. "Grandma, you look different," Emma announced, studying Margaret's face with childish directness. "You're smiling more." "Am I?" Margaret laughed, hugging her granddaughter close. "I suppose I have reason to?" Daniel had made himself scarce during the initial arrival, giving the family time to settle in. He appeared an hour later, knocking politely at the front door, though he could have come through the back as had become his custom. Margaret opened the door, aware of Ellie watching closely from the living room. Daniel stood on the porch, freshly shaven, wearing clean jeans and the button-down shirt Margaret had helped him select from a thrift store the previous week. He looked nervous but dignified. "Please come in," Margaret said warmly. "I'd like you to meet my family." The introductions were initially awkward, with Ellie maintaining a polite but reserved demeanor. Mark was more naturally friendly, engaging Daniel in conversation about the house repairs, while Jacob observed everything with teenage wariness. Emma, however, took to Daniel immediately. "Grandma says you were a teacher," she said, parking herself next to him on the sofa. "What did you teach?" "Literature," Daniel replied, his tension visibly easing at the straightforward question. "Poetry, novels, plays. Like Shakespeare?" Emma asked. "We're reading Romeo and Juliet in school." "It's confusing." "It can be," Daniel acknowledged with a smile. "But at its heart, it's just a story about young people making impulsive decisions." "That sounds like Jacob with his phone," Emma said, earning a glare from her brother. The innocent comment broke the ice, drawing reluctant laughter from everyone, including Ellie. From there, conversation flowed more naturally as they moved to the dining room for the Thanksgiving meal. Margaret had prepared traditional dishes: turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, with Daniel's help over the preceding days. Seeing the food arranged on the table, steam rising from serving dishes, brought a lump to her throat. This was how holidays were meant to be: shared, abundant, joyful. "Before we begin," Margaret said as everyone settled into their places, "I'd like to say something." She took a deep breath, looking around at the faces of those gathered: her daughter and son-in-law, her grandchildren, and Daniel, whose presence had catalyzed this revival. "This past year has been one of unexpected blessings," she continued. "After losing Robert, I thought my life was essentially over, that I would simply exist until it was my turn to go. I was wrong." Her eyes met Daniel's briefly. "Sometimes help and healing come from the most unexpected sources. I'm grateful for all of you, for this food, for this home, and for second chances." "Hear, hear," Mark said warmly, raising his glass. "To second chances," Ellie echoed, her earlier reservation softening as she observed her mother's evident happiness. The meal progressed with growing warmth, conversation flowing more easily as they ate. Daniel spoke little unless directly addressed, but when he did contribute, especially on topics of literature or history, his knowledge and eloquence were evident. Margaret watched as Ellie's expression gradually shifted from suspicion to reluctant respect. After dinner, while Margaret and Ellie cleared dishes, Daniel engaged both grandchildren in a card game at the dining room table, explaining rules with patient good humor and letting Emma win just often enough to keep her interested without making it obvious. "He's good with them," Ellie observed quietly as they loaded the dishwasher. "He was a teacher for 20 years. Margaret replied, keeping her tone neutral despite her inner satisfaction at Ellie's acknowledgement. Ellie rinsed a plate, her expression thoughtful. "You seem revitalized since I last saw you." "I feel it," Margaret admitted. "Having someone to care for, to talk with, it's made a difference." "And he's been entirely appropriate?" Ellie asked carefully. "Completely," Margaret assured her. "He stays in the shed, helps with tasks I can't manage alone, joins me for meals and conversation. He's a friend, Ellie." "A good one." Ellie nodded slowly. "I can see that. And I'm glad you're not alone anymore." She hesitated. "But Mom, what's the long-term plan here? He can't live in Dad's shed forever." The question caught Margaret unprepared, though she should have anticipated it. "We haven't discussed that," she said honestly. "It began as a temporary arrangement during the storm, then extended to help with winter preparations. Beyond that?" She shrugged. "We take each day as it comes." "That doesn't sound like you," Ellie observed. "You've always been a planner." Margaret smiled slightly. "Perhaps I'm learning new approaches in my 70s. The evening concluded with pie and coffee in the living room, the family gradually relaxing into Daniel's presence. When Margaret mentioned his help with planting spring bulbs, Emma immediately asked for a garden tour, undeterred by the November darkness. "Tomorrow, sweetheart," Margaret promised. "Daniel can show you exactly where we planted everything." "Will there be flowers at Christmas when we come back?" Emma wanted to know. "Not until spring," Daniel explained. "But that's the magic of gardening, planting with faith in a future you can't yet see." The simple wisdom of his statement resonated with Margaret. Wasn't that what they were both doing in their unexpected friendship? Planting seeds of connection, trust, and renewal, believing in possibilities neither could fully envision? Later, after her family had gone to bed and Daniel had returned to the shed, Margaret sat alone in the kitchen, savoring the day's success. The initial awkwardness had given way to genuine warmth, with even Ellie grudgingly admitting that Daniel was nothing like she'd expected. It felt like a turning point, not just for the holiday, but for whatever lay ahead. The remaining days of the Thanksgiving visit solidified Daniel's acceptance into the family's orbit. He took Emma and Jacob sledding after an unexpected early snowfall, helped Mark install the new back porch light Margaret had been meaning to replace, and engaged in a lengthy discussion of classic literature with Ellie, whose English major background found common ground with his teaching experience. By the time the family packed to leave on Sunday, Daniel had transitioned from suspicious stranger to welcomed addition. Ellie hugged him briefly before getting into the car, a gesture that brought unexpected moisture to his eyes. "Take care of my mom," she said, quiet enough that Margaret couldn't hear from the porch. "I will," Daniel promised, "for as long as she'll let me." As the car pulled away, Margaret and Daniel stood side by side on the porch, waving until the vehicle disappeared around the corner. "That went better than I expected," Daniel admitted as they turned to go back inside. "They're good people," Margaret said simply. "Once they got to know you, how could they not see what I see?" The warmth in her voice brought color to Daniel's weathered cheeks. He ducked his head slightly, still uncomfortable with direct praise. "Thank you for including me. It meant more than I can say." Inside, they fell into their familiar routine of cleaning up together, the house unusually quiet after days of family activity. As they worked, Margaret found herself contemplating Ellie's question about the future. What was the long-term plan? Could this arrangement, this friendship, continue indefinitely? Should it? Before she could formulate these thoughts into words, Daniel spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, carefully drying a serving platter before returning it to the cabinet. "With winter setting in, I should look for some steady work. Day labor gets scarce when construction slows down." Margaret nodded, unsure where this was leading. "That makes sense. There's a night janitor position open at the elementary school," he continued. "It's not teaching, but it's steady, indoors, and includes benefits after a probationary period." "That sounds promising," Margaret said, feeling simultaneously pleased at his initiative and oddly unsettled at the implications of his independence. "If I get it," Daniel said, his tone careful, "I could contribute properly to household expenses. Pay actual rent for the shed, help with utilities. Make this arrangement more equitable." Margaret turned to face him fully, surprised by the suggestion. "You think I've been keeping a ledger of what you owe me?" Daniel met her gaze steadily. "No, but I've been keeping one of what I owe myself, my self-respect, my independence. You've given me a foundation to rebuild from, Margaret. I need to use it." The quiet dignity in his voice silenced any argument she might have made. This wasn't about money or arrangements. It was about a man reclaiming his place in the world after years adrift. "I understand," she said finally. "And I think it's a wonderful idea." Daniel's expression relaxed into relief. "I have an interview on Tuesday. Would you mind if I borrowed Robert's blue tie? The one with the small pattern?" "Of course not," Margaret said, touched that he'd asked rather than assumed. "And I'll press your shirt." "You don't need to." "I want to," she interrupted gently. "That's what friends do." The word hung between them, simultaneously accurate and insufficient for what they had become to each other. Tuesday arrived with crystalline winter sunshine that belied the biting cold. Margaret helped Daniel prepare for his interview with the nervous energy of a mother sending a child off to the first day of school. She ironed his shirt to crisp perfection, selected the appropriate tie from Robert's collection, and insisted on driving him to the school despite his protests that he could walk. "It's 15 degrees out there," she argued. "You can't show up with a red nose and frozen ears." Daniel acquiesced with good-humored surrender, accepting her fussing as the expression of care that it was. "You'll do wonderfully," she assured him as she pulled up at the school entrance. "Just be yourself." Daniel smiled, adjusting Robert's tie one final time. "Thank you for believing in me." "Always," Margaret replied, the word escaping before she could consider its implications. She watched him walk into the building, straight-backed and dignified despite the second-hand clothes and years of hardship etched into his face. Pride welled in her chest, not the possessive pride of having shaped or changed him, but the pure pride of witnessing someone's courage in the face of life's cruelties. Margaret spent the morning in purposeful distraction, cleaning already clean surfaces and reorganizing kitchen cabinets that needed no reorganization. When the phone rang shortly after noon, she nearly dropped the canister she was holding. "I got it," Daniel said without preamble, his voice vibrating with contained excitement. "I start Monday." "That's wonderful," Margaret exclaimed, genuine joy flooding through her. "I knew you would. Would you mind picking me up? The principal wants to show me around the facility this afternoon. I'll be right there." The drive home was filled with details, hours, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., responsibilities, general cleaning, floor buffing, minor maintenance, and salary, modest but steady, with health insurance after 90 days. Daniel recounted it all with the wonder of a man who had almost forgotten what stability felt like. "We should celebrate," Margaret declared as they pulled into the driveway. "I'll make that pot roast you liked so much." Daniel's smile was incandescent. "I'd like that." That evening, over pot roast and Robert's best bottle of wine, saved for a special occasion that hadn't come before his death, they spoke of practical matters, how Daniel would manage the night shift, adjustments to their meal routines, his plans to open a bank account and begin rebuilding his financial life. "It's not where I thought I'd be at 56, he admitted, swirling the ruby liquid in his glass. starting over as a janitor. But it's honest work, and more than I dared hope for a few months ago. Life rarely follows our planned trajectories, Margaret observed. When I was young, I thought I'd be a university librarian, surrounded by rare books and academic discourse. Instead, I became a school librarian, then a mother, then a widow. She smiled softly. Each role brought joys I couldn't have anticipated. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. There's a quote I used to share with my students. Seneca, I think. Fate leads the willing and drags the unwilling. I've been dragged for years. It feels good to be willing again. The quiet profundity of his statement lingered between them, accompanied by the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional pop from the fireplace embers. To new beginnings, Margaret said, raising her glass. And to unexpected blessings, Daniel added, touching his glass to hers. The winter months passed in a rhythm of adjustments and small triumphs. Daniel adapted to his night shift schedule, sleeping during the day in the shed that Margaret had further insulated and improved with blackout curtains. He took his evening meal with her before work, then prepared his own breakfast when he returned in the morning while she still slept. Their periods of overlapping wakefulness became precious, late afternoons and early evenings spent in companionable activities. They read together in the living room, took walks when weather permitted, watched documentaries that sparked thoughtful discussions. On weekends, when Daniel switched back to a day schedule, they tackled household projects or explored local museums and parks. Margaret observed the changes in Daniel with quiet satisfaction. With regular meals and stability, his gaunt frame filled out. His first paycheck went toward a proper haircut and new work shoes, the second toward opening a savings account. By the third, he insisted on contributing to household expenses, a non-negotiable point of pride she ultimately respected. Changes in herself were equally pronounced, if less visible. The fog of grief that had shrouded her days had lifted, replaced by purpose and engagement. She began volunteering at the library one morning a week, rediscovering her love of connecting young readers with just the right book. She joined a knitting circle at the community center, forming cautious new friendships with women who shared her stage of life. "You're blooming," her doctor commented during her annual checkup in February. "Your blood pressure's down, you've gained a healthy 5 pounds, and that persistent vitamin D deficiency has corrected itself. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." What she was doing, Margaret realized, was living again, participating in life rather than merely observing it from behind a veil of loss. As winter yielded to early spring, the bulbs she and Daniel had planted began to emerge. First the snowdrops, then crocuses, followed by early daffodils. Each green shoot pushing through the soil felt symbolic, a testament to faith rewarded, to life's persistence. One mild March evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Daniel broached a subject they had tacitly avoided. "I received a letter today," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "From my son." Margaret turned to him, surprised. In all their conversations, Daniel rarely spoke of his estrangement from his only child. She knew the broad outlines, how his descent into alcoholism after job loss and divorce had alienated his college-aged son, how attempts at reconciliation had been rebuffed, how years of separation had calcified into silence. "I wrote to him at Christmas," Daniel continued. "Told him about my new job, my situation here, that I was sober, stable. And he responded," Margaret said softly. "That's wonderful." Daniel nodded, his expression a complex mixture of hope and apprehension. "He's cautious, understandably so. But he's willing to meet when he comes east for a conference next month." He hesitated. "He'll be in Hartford. About an hour's drive? You'll need the car," Margaret said immediately, understanding the unasked question. "Of course you can take it. I can manage for a day. Would you—" Daniel paused, vulnerability crossing his features. "Would you come with me?" "Not to the actual meeting," he added quickly. "That needs to be just us. But for the drive, I'm not sure I trust myself to drive there alone. Too much opportunity to talk myself out of it." The request touched Margaret deeply. "I'd be honored." April arrived with characteristic changeability, warm, flower-scented days interspersed with blustery reminders that winter hadn't fully released its grip. The garden burst into vibrant life, tulips and hyacinths creating swaths of color against the awakening lawn. Margaret found herself spending more time outdoors, her camera, unused for years, rediscovered and employed to capture the daily transformations. She even created an online photo album to share with Ellie and the grandchildren, her technological skills rusty but serviceable. "Mom, these are beautiful," Ellie commented during their weekly call. "You should consider selling some prints. Remember how the library used to display your nature photography?" The suggestion startled Margaret, the idea that her hobby could have value beyond personal pleasure. "Perhaps," she said, non-committal but secretly pleased. "How are the children?" "Good," Emma asked when we can visit again. "She wants to see the flowers and Mr. Daniel. I think she has a bit of a crush." Margaret laughed. "She has excellent taste. And you're all welcome anytime, you know that." There was a slight pause. "Actually, I was thinking about Memorial Day weekend, if that works for you. Mark has a 3-day break from the hospital rotation." "That would be wonderful," Margaret said warmly. "We'd love to have you." Only after hanging up did she register her unconscious use of "we" rather than "I," a slip that revealed how thoroughly Daniel had become integrated into her concept of home. The day of Daniel's meeting with his son dawned clear and mild, perfect spring weather that belied the emotional turbulence of the occasion. Margaret found him at the kitchen table before sunrise, already dressed in his best clothes, no longer second-hand but purchased with his own earnings, staring into a cup of coffee gone cold. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, filling the kettle for tea. Daniel offered a wan smile. "Not much." "Understandable." Margaret sat across from him, reaching across to cover his hand with hers. "Whatever happens today, remember how far you've come. That's a victory in itself." Daniel turned his hand to clasp hers briefly. "Having you in my corner makes all the difference." They set out after breakfast, the drive to Hartford filled with alternating conversation and comfortable silence. Daniel reviewed what he knew of his son's life, his coding job with a tech company, his recent engagement, his apparent success despite the chaos of his early adulthood. "I missed so much," he said quietly as they crossed the state line. "Graduations, first job, finding someone to love. All those milestones parents are supposed to witness. But you're here now," Margaret reminded him gently, "ready to be present for whatever comes next." The meeting was scheduled at a coffee shop near the convention center where Daniel's son, Michael, was attending a technology conference. Margaret dropped Daniel off at the entrance, squeezing his hand one last time in encouragement. "I'll be at that bookstore we passed," she said. "Take as much time as you need." "Thank you," Daniel replied, his voice tight with emotion. "For everything." Margaret watched him walk into the coffee shop, shoulders squared with determined courage, before driving to the bookstore. Despite her reassurances, anxiety fluttered in her chest. What if the meeting went poorly? What if Michael rejected Daniel's attempts at reconciliation? The pain would be devastating. 2 hours later, immersed in a gardening book she wasn't really absorbing, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. Daniel had purchased a basic cell phone with his second paycheck, insisting on the practicality of being reachable during their separate activities. "Could you come to the coffee shop? I'd like you to meet someone." Margaret's heart leapt into her throat. The request suggested a positive outcome beyond her cautious hopes. She gathered her belongings with trembling hands and hurried to the car. At the coffee shop, she spotted them immediately, Daniel sitting across from a younger man whose features echoed his own, their postures mirroring each other in unconscious symmetry. Daniel looked up as the bell above the door announced her entrance, his face radiant with quiet joy. "Margaret," he called, rising to meet her. "This is my son, Michael." The young man stood as well, extending his hand with a smile that revealed the same crinkles around the eyes as his father's. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Wilson. My father has told me a lot about you." "All good, I hope," Margaret replied, clasping his hand warmly. "And please, it's Margaret." "Join us?" Daniel invited, pulling out a chair for her. As she settled in, Margaret observed the subtle signs of emotional discussion, Michael's slightly reddened eyes, Daniel's damp handkerchief peeking from his pocket, the collection of crumpled napkins on the table between them. But there was also unmistakable warmth, a tentative bridge being rebuilt over the chasm of years. Their conversation remained careful but genuine as Michael shared details about his fiancée, their upcoming wedding plans, his work developing educational software. When he hesitantly extended an invitation to the wedding, "It's small, just close friends and family, but we'd like you to be there, Dad." Daniel's composure briefly cracked, a sheen of tears brightening his eyes. "I'd be honored," he managed, his voice husky with emotion. "Both of you," Michael added, glancing at Margaret. "From what Dad's told me, you're an important part of his life now." The simple acknowledgement brought unexpected heat to Margaret's cheeks. "Thank you, but I wouldn't want to intrude on a family occasion." "You wouldn't be," Michael insisted. "Melanie, my fiancée, and I believe family is who shows up for you, who supports your growth. You've done that for my father when I—" He paused, swallowing hard. "When I couldn't." The drive home was quieter than the journey out, but with a different quality, not the tense silence of anticipation, but the peaceful quiet of profound gratitude. "He seems like a wonderful young man," Margaret observed as they crossed back into their home state. "You should be proud." "I am," Daniel said softly, "though I can't take much credit. He became who he is despite me, not because of me." "Don't underestimate the early years," Margaret countered. "The foundation you laid before things went wrong. And don't underestimate his capacity for forgiveness, for seeing the man you truly are." Daniel turned to look at her, the setting sun gilding his profile. "You saw that man before I remembered he existed, when I was just a homeless stranger helping with spilled groceries." "Perhaps," Margaret acknowledged. "Or perhaps we both needed to be seen, really seen, by someone without preconceptions or shared history. Sometimes it takes fresh eyes to recognize what's always been there." The sentiment lingered between them as they continued homeward, the car filled with the soft gold of early evening light and the quiet hum of new possibilities. Spring unfurled fully in the weeks that followed, bringing longer days, warmer temperatures, and a garden riotous with color. Margaret's photo collection expanded, capturing not just flowers but moments: Daniel asleep in the porch swing, a book open on his chest, a family of rabbits that had taken residence under the shed, sunrise mist rising from the lawn after an overnight shower. In the shed, now more properly a small cabin with its accumulated improvements, Daniel created a writing desk from salvaged materials. There, during his off hours, he began composing what he called his reclamation project, essays reflecting on literature, teaching, loss, and redemption. "I might try submitting some to journals," he mentioned one evening as they planted summer vegetables in the newly expanded garden beds. "Educational publications, maybe. Nothing may come of it, but it feels good to engage with ideas again." "They're excellent," Margaret assured him, having read several at his hesitant request. "Your voice is still there, the teacher, the scholar. It never really left." Daniel straightened, stretching his back after bending over the tomato seedlings. "Sometimes I wonder who I'd be now if we hadn't met that day. If you hadn't offered shelter from the storm?" Margaret considered the question. "And sometimes I wonder who I'd be if you hadn't stopped to help with my spilled groceries. Still existing rather than living, I suspect. Life's strange geometry," Daniel mused. "How seemingly random intersections change everything." "I don't think it was random," Margaret said quietly. "Not really." Daniel's eyes, still that remarkable shade of summer sky blue, held hers for a long moment. "Neither do I." The unspoken something that had been building between them, deeper than friendship, different from romance, yet containing elements of both, seemed to crystallize in that moment of shared recognition. Whatever name it had or didn't have, it was profound and transformative, a second blooming neither had anticipated in the winter seasons of their lives. As Memorial Day approached, bringing Ellie's family visit with it, Margaret found herself anticipating rather than dreading the disruption to their established routine. The house would be full again, with children's laughter, with multiple conversations, with the beautiful chaos of family life. The morning of their arrival, Margaret and Daniel worked together preparing the guest rooms, airing out linens, arranging flowers from the garden in small vases. "I could stay with a co-worker this weekend," Daniel offered as they made up the sofa bed in the den for Jacob. "Give you private time with your family." Margaret looked up sharply from tucking in a sheet corner. "Absolutely not. You're part of this household now. Ellie and the children are expecting you to be here." Daniel's expression softened. "Thank you for that. For making space for me in your life." "You created your own space," Margaret replied simply, "and we're all better for it." The visit unfolded with ease and warmth far beyond Margaret's expectations. Ellie, seeing her mother truly thriving, relaxed her earlier reservations about Daniel's presence. Mark engaged him in lengthy discussions about woodworking projects and local sports teams. Jacob, initially standoffish, opened up when Daniel showed interest in his coding projects, offering experienced teaching insights on presenting technical information. And Emma, true to form, appointed herself Daniel's special assistant in all things, following him through garden tasks and household projects with unwavering devotion. On Saturday evening, as they all gathered on the back porch after dinner, watching fireflies begin their nightly display over the lawn, Margaret felt a completeness she'd thought forever lost after Robert's death. Different, certainly. The shape of her happiness had transformed, but no less profound. Ellie joined her at the porch railing, handing her a glass of lemonade. "You look content, Mom." Margaret smiled, watching Daniel demonstrate to Emma how to cup her hands around a captured firefly. "I am." "Daniel's good for you," Ellie acknowledged, her earlier skepticism completely dissolved. "You're good for each other." "Yes," Margaret agreed simply. There seemed no need for further explanation. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed and Mark and Ellie had retired to the guest room, Margaret found Daniel still on the porch, gazing up at the stars. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, joining him on the swing. Daniel made room for her, his shoulder warm against hers as they settled into a gentle rocking rhythm. "I was thinking about answered prayers," he said after a moment. "Oh?" 3 years ago, at my lowest point sleeping under bridges, I prayed not for wealth or even comfort, but for purpose, for a chance to be useful again, to matter to someone. He turned to her, his expression visible in the soft porch light. "I never imagined the answer would come in the form of a rain-soaked widow with spilled groceries." Margaret's breath caught at the echo of her own experience. "I prayed too," she admitted, "after Robert died. Not for another husband or even companionship, really, but for a reason to keep going. Something beyond mere existence." She smiled softly. "A homeless literature teacher wasn't what I had in mind either." Daniel's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers intertwining with her own in a gesture that felt both new and familiar. "A lonely widow helped a homeless man, unaware he was the answer to her prayers," he murmured, an echo of their very first meeting now transformed into something profound. "And a homeless man helped a lonely widow, finding his own prayers answered in the process." Margaret completed the thought. Above them, stars wheeled in ancient patterns, bearing witness to this most human of miracles. Two broken lives finding wholeness together, not despite their damage, but because of how it opened them to grace, to connection, to the possibility that the end of one chapter might be the beginning of another, equally beautiful story. As fireflies danced in the garden they'd planted together, Margaret and Daniel sat in comfortable silence, their joined hands a testament to the unexpected ways love manifests in lives open to receiving it. Not always as romance or passion, but sometimes as friendship so profound it becomes its own kind of love story, one of mutual rescue, of matched brokenness becoming shared strength, of second chances neither could have found alone. And in that moment of perfect understanding, no further words were needed.